Tell me the truth, the Mafia boss said. And her secret changed everything. A dark Mafia romance. Dante Alessio Ravello times, Serafina Bellante. Act 1. The night I walked into his world, I have made exactly 3 mistakes in my adult life. The first, trusting a city that only rewards cruelty. The second, believing I could walk through fire without getting burned. The third, and the one that changed everything, was the night I looked across a room full of dangerous men and let Dante Ravello catch me staring. It was a Thursday, late October, the kind of night where the sky over Manhattan sits so low and heavy with rain that the city feels like it's been sealed inside a bottle. I remember that detail because I kept thinking, if something goes wrong tonight, no one outside these walls will ever know. The Elysian House was the kind of private club that didn't advertise. No website, no reviews. If you had to ask how to find it, you weren't invited. It operated out of a converted townhouse on the Upper East Side, 6 floors of mahogany paneling, imported whiskey, and men whose fortunes existed entirely in cash. The public knew nothing about it, which was, of course, the point. I'd been hired by one of its members, a collector named Holt, to appraise and catalog a private acquisition. 17 leather-bound ledgers, mid-century Sicilian origin, from the estate of a deceased financier. Perfectly legitimate, perfectly above board. That's what I told myself as I signed the NDA, nodded at the terms, and let a black SUV with no plates carry me across the park. The man who met me at the door was wide as a door frame and said nothing. He checked a list on a tablet, looked at me like I was a notation in a column, and led me to a side room on the 2nd floor. Holt's collection was laid out on a long table under reading lamps. I set my bag down, pulled on my gloves, and got to work. For 90 minutes, I cataloged in peace. The ledgers were beautiful, the kind of documentary history that made my archivist's heart ache. Entries in faded Italian cursive, property transactions, names, numbers. I photographed each page carefully, made my notes, breathed slowly, and then someone opened the wrong door. It wasn't my fault, and it was entirely my fault. I'd run out of reference tags and stepped into the corridor to find the assistant who'd been stationed outside. He was gone. The corridor was dim, and the ambient noise of the event below, low music, the murmur of money, drifted up the staircase. I followed the sound 2 doors down, looking for anyone staff adjacent, and pushed open a door that turned out not to be a staff room. It was a private study, and the man standing at the window, holding a glass of scotch and a phone to his ear, was the kind of man you don't stumble into by accident. You stumble into him, and your whole life rearranges itself around the collision. He was tall, well over 6 feet, in a suit so precisely cut it looked like architecture. Dark hair pushed back from a face that had been assembled by someone who understood the grammar of intimidation. Strong jaw, heavy brow, a mouth that was full but unsmiling. He was perhaps 36. He looked like he had never in his life been surprised by anything. Until I walked through his door. He lowered the phone without breaking eye contact. "You're in the wrong room," he said. His voice was quiet. Quiet the way deep water is quiet. Quiet that means there's a great deal of pressure below the surface. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, I work for Holt. I was looking for—" "I know who you are," he said. That stopped me. He hadn't moved, hadn't shifted his weight, hadn't raised his voice. He just looked at me across 10 feet of Persian carpet with those black espresso eyes and said 4 words that rewired something in my chest. "I know who you are." I should have backed out of the room. Apologized, returned to my ledgers, finished my job, gone home. That was the intelligent, survivable choice. Instead, something in me held very still and looked back at him. Just for one breath. One foolish, electrified breath. And that was enough. That was the entire mistake. I left the room, found my assistant, finished the catalog, got in the car, went home. But when I closed my eyes that night, what I saw was him, Dante Alessio Ravello. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know what he was. I only knew that when his eyes found mine in that study, something had shifted, some quiet tectonic movement deep below the surface of my ordinary life. I lay in my apartment in Brooklyn, listening to rain hammer the fire escape, and told myself it was nothing. I was so wrong. If this is already pulling you in, a quick subscribe keeps the darkness coming. You won't want to miss what happens next. My real last name was Belante. I had been using Sinclair, my mother's maiden name, since I was 19, when I rebuilt myself out of the wreckage of everything our family name had once cost us. On paper, in every professional record and lease and tax filing, I was Serafina Sinclair, archivist, Brooklyn, unremarkable. The Belante name was a wound I kept covered. And like all covered wounds, it had never properly healed. My father, Vittorio Belante, had been a consigliere in the Ravello family for 11 years. He was the kind of man who understood power the way a surgeon understands the body, not with admiration, but with precise, dangerous fluency. He advised, mediated, protected. He was trusted. Then he was accused. I was 17 when the night came that destroyed us. It arrived without warning, the way all catastrophic things do, as an ordinary evening that simply did not stop. My father received a phone call at dinner. He went pale. He looked at my mother and said 4 words I have never forgotten. "Take Sarah away." My mother drove us to a cousin's house in New Jersey. We waited. My father never came. What I learned later, in fragments, from whispers, from documents I spent years tracking down, was this. Vittorio Belante had been accused of passing family intelligence to a rival syndicate. The accusation came from a man named Enzo Ravello, Dante's father. It was backed by a ledger, a record of payments. Evidence, they called it. Except it was fabricated. I knew it was fabricated because I'd found the original document, the real ledger, by the time I was 24. It had been buried in a private estate sale, misfiled under a dead man's inventory. 7 pages of handwritten accounting, clear as daylight, showing that the payments attributed to my father were actually authorized transactions for the family's own off-book interests. The accusation had been a cleanup operation. Someone powerful had needed a scapegoat. My father had been convenient. He died in a holding facility 8 months after his arrest. Officially, cardiac event. My mother lasted 2 more years before grief finished what circumstance had started. I buried them both. And then I got very quiet. The real ledger was photocopied and hidden. Over the following years, I built a career in archival work, a field that gave me access to private collections, sealed estates, institutional records. I wasn't just cataloging history. I was searching for the original signed order, the documentation that would prove not only that my father was innocent, but that Enzo Ravello had knowingly destroyed an innocent man. It was that search that brought me to Holt's private club. It was that search that put me in Dante Ravello's study. I had not expected Dante to be there. I had not expected him to be what he was. I knew his name in the abstract. The next king, they called him, Enzo's son, who had taken the empire after his father's retirement and made it twice as powerful and half as visible. I had constructed him in my mind as a silhouette, a symbol, the shape of everything that had taken my family apart. I had not constructed him as a man with black eyes who said, "I know who you are," in a voice like dark water. 3 days after the gala, a card was delivered to my office. No envelope, no postage. hand-delivered by a man in a dark suit who set it on my desk without a word and left before I could ask any questions. The card was cream cardstock, heavy, with no logo or letterhead. On one side, in clean handwriting, Friday, 8 o'clock. Ravello and Associates, 1 Park Plaza, 40th floor. Your presence is requested. DAR. I turned the card over twice, set it down, picked it up again. Requested. It was a word that didn't quite mean what it said. I knew, sitting at my desk with that cream card in my hand, that this was a door. And once I opened it, the corridor behind it would be one way. I went anyway, because the man whose initial was on that card was the son of the man who had destroyed my family. And if Dante Ravello wanted me in a room, I was going to be in that room. I was going to learn everything I could. I was going to find my proof. What I had not accounted for was the possibility that I might also find something else entirely. The 40th floor of 1 Park Plaza was everything a man like Dante would choose. Not ostentatious, not the gilded maximalism of old money trying to prove something. It was restrained and precise. Charcoal walls, warm lighting, bookshelves that held actual books in actual order, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking a city that looked, from up here, like something he owned. Because he did. His assistant, a composed woman who introduced herself as Elena, offered me water and seated me in a chair that cost more than my monthly rent. I sat with my coat still on and my hands very still in my lap and watched the door. He came in without announcement. No knock, no prelude. Dante Ravello simply arrived in a room the way weather arrived, preceding itself by a pressure change, a shift in the air. He sat across from me, a low table between us. He looked exactly as he had at the gala, contained, watchful, unhurried in the way of men who have never needed to rush because the world waits for them. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said requested," I replied. The distinction seemed relevant to mention. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, something quieter than that. "You're right," he said. "I should have been direct. I am asking you to come and work for me." He laid it out cleanly. His private collection, family records, legal documents, estate inventories, historical correspondence, had been in storage for 4 years following his father's retirement. It needed a comprehensive archival overhaul, cataloging, digital preservation, provenance documentation. The firm that had previously handled it had been dismissed. He had been looking for a replacement. My work for Holt had come to his attention. It was, on its surface, a perfectly reasonable job offer. 6 months, competitive compensation, full access to the collection, full access to the collection. Those 5 words were a detonation. The documentation I'd been searching for, the signed authorization that would prove my father's framing, would almost certainly be within the Ravello private records. Dante had just offered me a map to the very place I'd spent years trying to reach. He couldn't know that. He couldn't possibly know. Or so I told myself. "Why me, specifically?" I asked. "Because you're good," he said simply, "and because you know how to be discreet." "What does the discretion cover?" "The existence of the collection, its contents, your presence in my household." He said household with a weight that made me sit straighter. "This would be a residential engagement," he continued. "The collection is kept at my primary residence outside the city. You would need to be on site for the duration of the project. Accommodation is provided. Travel is not an issue. Your current obligations would need to be paused or transferred." I took a breath. His primary residence. Live-in access. Months inside the walls of the Ravello estate. Every rational alarm I possessed was ringing. Every desperate, grief-trained part of me that had spent 10 years working toward this moment went very, very quiet. "And if I decline?" I asked. He held my gaze for a moment. Then, "Your current lease is due for renewal in 6 weeks. Your largest contract client, the Ashworth Estate, is currently under advisement from a firm associated with my portfolio. I mention this not as a threat, only as context." There it was. Not a gun, not a raised voice, just information laid on the table between us like a hand of cards he didn't need to play because I could see his entire hand already. I looked at him. He looked at me. Outside, 40 floors below, New York moved in its indifferent millions. "When do I start?" I said. "Monday," he said. Comment below. If you were Sarah, would you take the offer? Or walk away while you still could? Tell me what you would do. The estate was in Westchester, 40 minutes north of the city, down a private road so cleanly maintained it might have been a film set. The house itself was something between a manor and a fortress. 3 stories of pale stone, black ironwork, mature trees that blocked the sightlines from the road. Beautiful, intentionally opaque. Nico Moretti, Dante's enforcer, a compact man in his 40s with a face like weathered granite and eyes that cataloged everything, met me at the gate and drove me to the main entrance. He carried my bags without being asked. He showed me to a suite on the 2nd floor with windows facing the garden and said, "You need anything, you ask me. You don't wander the property at night. You don't enter the east wing without escort. Clear?" "Clear," I said. He nodded and left. My room was too beautiful to feel like confinement. That, I suspected, was the point. A 4-poster bed in dark wood, softest linens I'd ever slept in, a private bath, a writing desk, and a wall of shelves that someone had stocked with books. Actual curated books, not decorative spines, real titles and fields I actually read. I stood in front of that bookshelf for 5 minutes, running my fingers along the spines, confused by the sensation of being precisely understood by a man I barely knew. The collection was housed in a long room off the ground floor library, a proper archive space, climate-controlled, with metal shelving and acid-free boxes and a work table under good lighting. When Dante showed it to me the first morning, he stood in the doorway and watched my face as I took in the scope of it. "There is no inventory," he said. "None of it has been formally cataloged. How long has it been accumulating? 3 generations. 3 generations of a Mafia dynasty's private paperwork." I could have wept. I kept my face neutral and said, "I'll need 2 weeks for assessment alone." "You have whatever time you need," he said. In the first week, I found my rhythm. Mornings in the archive, afternoons cross-referencing dates and names against external records I kept on my own encrypted drive, evenings in the kitchen or the study. Dante was present and absent in equal measure. He kept long hours, traveled twice to the city, occasionally appeared in the doorway of the archive to watch me work in silence. He never asked what I'd found. He never looked at the boxes I was opening. He trusted me, or he was performing trust with such precision that the effect was identical. On the 9th day, I got the call that almost broke my cover entirely. My Aunt Carmela, my father's sister, the woman who'd raised me through the worst years, who lived alone now in a walk-up in the Bronx, had been taken to the hospital. A fall on the stairs, fractured hip, surgery that afternoon. I sat in the archive with my phone pressed to my chest, eyes closed, running calculations. I could not leave. If I left now, I'd lose access. If I asked permission to leave, I'd invite questions I couldn't safely answer. Carmela had no one else. Her children were abroad. Her neighbors were strangers. I must have looked visibly distressed when I surfaced from the archive, because Dante met me in the corridor and said, without preamble, "What happened?" I didn't want to tell him. I told him anyway. I don't know why. Fatigue, maybe, or something about the specific quality of his attention that made it harder to deflect than to speak. "My aunt is in surgery. She has no one." He looked at me for a moment. "Give me her information. I'll make sure she has everything she needs." "That's not necessary." "Name and hospital," he said, not unkindly, just final. By that evening, Carmela had a private room, a personal nurse through the night shift, and a bouquet of white roses on her windowsill because someone had thought to ask what her favorite flower was. I know this because she called me herself, baffled and delighted, asking who my rich friend was. I sat on the edge of my borrowed bed in Dante Ravello's house and felt something crack open in my chest, a hairline fracture in the clean, purposeful hatred I'd been carrying like a compass. He had done something unrequested, precise and generous, and entirely without audience. I did not know what to do with that, so I buried it and went back to work. I found the first fragment on a Tuesday. It was buried inside a box labeled Estate Correspondence, 1987 to 1994. Water-stained, tucked between a deed and a letter of introduction in someone else's handwriting. A single page, half a ledger entry, dates and initials and a reference number that matched the documents I'd been tracking for a decade. My hands didn't shake. They never did when I was working. My mind simply went very white and very clear, the way it did in moments of extreme precision, and I noted the box number, photographed the page, filed it in my encrypted archive, and kept moving. I was getting closer. That night, Dante found me on the back terrace at midnight, still dressed, sitting in the dark with a glass of wine I hadn't touched. "You haven't eaten?" he said, taking the chair beside me without asking. I lost track. "What did you find today?" I went still, looked at him. The night was clear and cold, the garden dark except for distant pathlights. "What makes you think I found something?" "Because you go quiet when something moves you," he said. "Not in the ordinary way. A specific quiet, like you're holding something still." It was disconcerting, being read that accurately by a man I'd been trying to remain unreadable to. I said, "An interesting document, possibly misfiled. I want to verify provenance before I note it formally." He accepted that, or he seemed to. He reached over and pushed my wine glass toward me. "Drink something. You're pale." We sat outside in the cold for nearly an hour, and he talked. Not about business, not about the empire, about a trip he'd taken to Palermo at 22, about the way certain cities hold their dead more visibly than others, about a book he'd been reading. I listened and said very little, and somewhere in the middle of a sentence about the quality of light in Sicily at dusk, I realized I was not sitting beside my enemy. I was sitting beside a man who was lonely in a particular way that looked, from the outside, like control. I don't know when the shift happened exactly. It was not a single moment. It was an accumulation. The way he always lowered his voice when we were alone, as though volume were a kind of violence he didn't want to visit on me. The way he learned how I took my coffee without asking. The way he once, without comment, moved a stack of boxes from a high shelf I was trying to reach, doing it quickly, as though getting out of the way before I could thank him. The night it became undeniable was a Saturday. I was working late again. He came to the archive around 11, and I don't know what was different about that particular night except that the house was quieter than usual, and the lamplight was amber and warm, and when he came to stand beside me at the work table to look at the document I was examining, he stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. He reached past me to angle the lamp better, and his arm brushed mine. We both went still. He turned his head. I turned mine. We were very close. He said my name once, just that. Just Sarah, in that low, dark voice, and the question in it was unmistakable. I didn't answer with words. I didn't need to. I closed the distance between us, and the rest was warmth and silence, and his hands in my hair, and the absolute terrifying sensation of wanting something I absolutely could not afford to want. Afterward, lying in the dark of his bedroom with the moonlight carving the ceiling into pale squares, he held me with an arm across my waist and breathed slowly. I lay awake, because somewhere in the archive beneath us was a document with his father's name on it. And I was no longer just a woman chasing justice. I was a woman in love with the wrong man, and those two facts were about to collide. Comment and let me know. Do you think Sarah should have told Dante the truth before things went this far? Or did she have no choice? 3 weeks later, I found the rest. It was in the last box on the last shelf of the most densely packed section of the archive, a section labeled Administrative Correspondence that no one had apparently opened in decades. Inside, 46 documents. Among them, a bound set of internal family communications from 1994, the year my father was accused. And inside that set, 9 pages in Enzo Ravello's own handwriting. I read them standing at the work table, not sitting down, because something in me understood that sitting would be a surrender to the weight of what was in front of me. The first 3 pages were internal assessments, financial projections, territory disputes with a rival family in Boston, logistical notes about a real estate venture. Ordinary. Page 4 changed everything. It was a directive, addressed to Marco Falcone's predecessor, a man named Argento, who had been Enzo's consigliere before his retirement. 2 sentences, handwritten, initialed, dated, authorizing the construction of a false evidence set, the ledger that would be used to frame Vittorio Bellante. It named my father specifically. It explained the motive. Vittorio had discovered something, a financial arrangement between Enzo and the Boston family that constituted a major act of betrayal against the Ravello interests. Rather than deal with what Vittorio knew, Enzo had decided to remove him, permanently, without blood on his own hands. The rest of the pages were the logistics, the manufactured evidence, the plan. I stood there for a long time. Then I sat down after all, because my legs gave out. 10 years. I had spent 10 years following this thread, and it had led here, to a box in a room in the house of the man I was in love with, whose father had signed a paper that killed mine. The timing of what happened next will matter to you. It was the same evening. Dante came to find me for dinner and found me still in the archive, sitting with the documents on the table in front of me, not moving. Sarah. His voice, when he said my name, had a different quality, not the intimacy of the past weeks, something careful, something that already knew. I looked up. He was standing in the doorway. His expression was very still. How long have you been sitting there? A few hours. He crossed the room slowly, looked at the documents without touching them. I watched his face as his eyes moved across the pages. I watched him read his father's handwriting. He straightened. A long silence. Then he walked to the window and stood with his back to me, and I could see the set of his shoulders, the way a man holds himself when something inside him is breaking very quietly. How long have you known? He asked. I found these today. No, he said. How long have you known what you were looking for? I should have lied. I could have lied. I'd been lying by omission for weeks. I didn't. Since I was 24, I said, when I found the first fragment. I've been searching for the authorization ever since. He didn't turn around. Bellante, he said. Not a question. I went cold. My father's name was Vittorio Bellante, I said. He was your father's consigliere. He was framed for... I know what happened to Vittorio Bellante. The room went very still. You knew? I whispered. He turned then. His face was stone, but his eyes, those black espresso eyes that had been finding mine across rooms for weeks, were something else entirely. Not everything. Not this. He gestured at the documents. I knew my father removed a man from his council under suspicious circumstances. I knew the explanation never fully held. I had the file reviewed 2 years ago and found inconsistencies I couldn't explain. I had my suspicions. And you said nothing. I had no proof. I had suspicion and a dead man's silence. He paused. Now I have proof. We looked at each other across the work table, across the 9 pages of evidence, across every layer of truth and concealment we had both been carrying into this room. I had come here to find something to destroy him with. He had apparently been, in his own way, already looking for it himself. I thought the hardest part was behind us. That was naive. It was also, in retrospect, what I deserved for thinking anything in Dante Ravello's world could be resolved in one honest conversation and a quiet night. Marco Falcone arrived 3 days later. I had encountered him twice before, both times briefly, both times in the context of Dante's professional life. He was Dante's consigliere, the role my father had once held for Enzo. Falcone was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of precise manners that coexisted easily with the capacity for violence. He had watched me, I realized in retrospect, with particular attention from my first week in the house. When Dante told me, quietly, on the morning of Falcone's visit, "Stay in your room today. Don't come to the meeting," I understood we had entered a different register. I stayed in my room for approximately 40 minutes. Then I found the service corridor that ran parallel to the East Wing study, a detail I had mapped in my first week because old habits die hard, and listened from 6 feet of insulated wall to a conversation that would have frightened me more if I hadn't already spent 10 years in the business of being frightened. Falcone knew about the documents. I didn't know how. Someone on staff, perhaps, or surveillance I hadn't found, or a source inside the family who had been monitoring the archival project from the beginning. But he knew, and more than that, he knew I was a Bellante. He had known longer than Dante had. "She came here with a purpose," Falcone said. "She has been working against this family from the moment she walked through Holt's door. You brought the enemy into your house." "I brought an archivist into my archive," Dante said. His voice was ice. "And she found documents that you knew existed. Those documents are unstable. In the wrong hands, they're in my hands," Dante said. "That's the only pair of hands in this conversation that matters." A pause. "She needs to be removed," Falcone said. "Discreetly, permanently, before any of this reaches outside." "Say that again," Dante said softly. Whatever Falcone saw in his face, it stopped the sentence. "The girl is a liability," Falcone said instead, slower now, more careful. "The girl," Dante said, "is under my protection. And if you raise this subject again in any form, in any room, to any person, what becomes a liability in this situation will not be her." I pressed my back against the wall and breathed through my mouth. Falcone left that afternoon. Whatever happened between them in the hours after, I wasn't told. Dante came to find me in the archive near evening and stood in the doorway looking tired for the first time since I'd known him. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked. "Enough." "I'm sorry." I looked up. In 3 weeks in this house, I had not heard Dante Ravello apologize for anything. "For what specifically?" I asked. "For what my father built. For the fact that you've been carrying this alone. For not—" He stopped, started again. "For the fact that I didn't ask your name before I asked you to come here. Your full name." I thought about my father, about the years of quiet, careful research, about the night I found Dante in the study and felt, against every rational alarm I possessed, that specific, terrifying recognition. "If you had asked," I said slowly, "I wouldn't have come, and I would never have found it." He held my gaze. "Is that a comfort?" "I don't know yet." But Falcone was not the only problem. Salvatore Barone, the rival underboss whose territory butted against the Ravello holdings in the Bronx, had been watching the estate. We learned this 2 days later, when Nico intercepted a pair of men on the property perimeter at 2 a.m. They were not there for a conversation. They were there because someone had told Barone that the Ravello archive held documents valuable enough to leverage, and someone, Falcone, or one of his connections, had pointed him in the right direction. Dante's world had a fracture line running through it, and I was standing directly above it. That night, the rain came. By 11 o'clock, it was a full-body storm, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just arrives and commits. The estate went dark in patches as power to the outbuildings flickered. Nico had doubled the perimeter security. Dante had been on the phone for 3 hours, and I had sat in the library with a glass of whiskey I didn't drink and the 9-page document in a sealed envelope on the cushion beside me. I had made a decision. It had taken me approximately 12 hours of thinking, which was 10 hours longer than I normally needed and 2 hours shorter than the decision probably deserved. I was going to give Dante the documents, not leverage them, not use them, not construct a strategy around their controlled release. Give them to him, cleanly, with my full accounting of how I'd obtained them and what I'd intended to do with them when I arrived. Because the man who had sat beside me in a cold garden and talked about Palermo, the man who had arranged white roses for my aunt without being asked, the man who had looked at his father's handwriting with the expression of someone absorbing a grief they had been waiting for, that man was not the monster I had built in my imagination, and I could not remain in his house, in his life, in his bed, and continue to hold a weapon aimed at him, even if it meant losing everything I'd spent 10 years working toward. He found me in the library just before midnight. He looked exhausted. He looked, more than that, like a man who had been performing composure for so many hours that the performance was beginning to show its edges. He sat down across from me, saw the envelope, and said nothing. "Tell me the truth, Sarah." Not an accusation, not an interrogation. It came out of him with something that sounded almost like grief, the words of someone who already knows the shape of what they're about to hear, but needs to hear it said plainly anyway. His voice was quiet. The fire was low. The rain pressed against the windows in continuous sheets. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning, all of it." So I did. I told him about my father, about the night my mother drove me away from our house and never came back to it, about the years of silence and reconstruction, about the fragment I'd found at 24, about building a career designed to give me access to exactly the kind of record I'd been looking for, about Holt's Club and the door I'd pushed open by mistake, and the moment I understood that the man standing at the window was Enzo's son, I told him about accepting his offer, knowing exactly what I was accepting. I told him that I hadn't counted on him. I told him that specifically, carefully, because it was the truest thing I'd said in weeks. I didn't plan to... I stopped, tried again. "The way I feel about you wasn't part of any plan. I need you to know that. Whatever you decide to do now, whatever happens next, I need you to know that what happened between us was real, that it is real, and that I am more sorry than I can measure for the way I came here." Dante sat very still through all of it. He looked at his hands once, briefly. Then he looked at me. When I finished, the silence stretched for a long time. Then he reached across and picked up the envelope, turned it over once. "My father was not a good man," he said. His voice was even, quiet. "I have known this in general terms for years. I have not known it in specific terms until this week." He set the envelope back down. "Vittorio Bellante should not have died in a holding facility. What was done to your family was wrong. It was done by someone using the Ravello name, and I wear that name, and I am going to correct it, to whatever extent it can be corrected." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means the documents will be used," he said. "Not to damage this family, they're already inside this family, but to formally clear your father's name. I have legal counsel with the standing to do that. It means Falcone is done, effective tonight. It means I am going to find out exactly how far the contamination runs and address it." He looked at me steadily. "And it means I am asking you to stay." I felt the words land in my chest like something warm. "Dante, not as an archivist," he said. "Not as a project, not as a secret or a complication or a liability." He held my gaze. "Stay because I'm asking you to. Because whatever you came here to find, I think you also found something else. And I'd like the chance, Sarah." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I looked at this man who ruled a world built partly on my family's bones, who had looked at his father's handwriting and gone to the window to grieve quietly, who had sent white roses to my aunt and never mentioned it again. I thought about the version of this I'd planned, the cold delivery of evidence, the legal channels, the justice without aftermath. And I thought, some reckonings are bigger than plans. Tell me in the comments, when Dante said stay, what would you have done? Could you forgive what his family did for a man like this? Salvatore Barone made his move at 3 a.m. Nico came to the library door. We were both still there, still in the aftermath of everything that had been said, and spoke 2 words. "They're inside." What followed was not the kind of chaos I'd imagined when I'd thought abstractly about what danger in this world might look like. It was faster and more specific than that. Dante was on his feet before Nico finished speaking. He said something low and quick that I didn't catch, and Nico nodded, and then Dante turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the controlled composure of the past weeks, but something rawer, deliberate. "Stay in this room. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone except Nico or me." "How many?" 4, maybe 5. Nico has them contained to the east wing." He held my face in his hands for one moment, one brief, steadying moment, and said quietly, "I will be back." He left. I locked the door. Then I looked at the envelope on the cushion, and I thought, no, the east wing. The section I was not supposed to enter without escort. The section I had mapped in my first week, out of habit and professional paranoia, and where I knew, because I'd seen the layout and read the floor plans in the estate's own documentation, there was a secondary access point to the archive from outside the building. An original service entrance, never formally sealed. The kind of vulnerability a man like Barone would have researched. If that entrance was how they'd gotten in, and the geography made it the most logical point of entry, then they weren't just there to intimidate. They were there for the archive, for the documents, for the leverage. I put the envelope in my jacket, tucked it flat against my ribs, and unlocked the library door. The corridor was dim and quiet. I moved fast and without noise, the way you learn to move when silence has been a survival tool for most of your adult life. I reached the east wing in 3 minutes, took the back staircase, and found the service corridor. The archive room was 30 feet ahead. The door was already open. The man inside was not one of Barone's soldiers. He was older, better dressed. He stood at my work table, going through boxes with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Falcone. Of course it was Falcone. He heard me, turned. The expression on his face moved through surprise and settled into something calculating. "Miss Bellante," he said, as though he'd been expecting me eventually. "You're looking for the Enzo Ravello directive," I said. My voice was steady. I was very calm in the way you get calm when there's nothing left to lose from directness. "You're too late. You have it. Dante has it." He went very still. "If Dante has it," Falcone said slowly, "then he also knows about my involvement in the original operation." "Yes," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. I was not frightened of him. That surprised me afterward, but I'd spent 10 years being frightened of what this document could do in the wrong hands, and the document was no longer in the wrong hands. It was in Dante's. Whatever Falcone did to me in the next 30 seconds would not change that. He reached for something in his jacket. Dante came through the door. What happened after was brief and very definitive. Nico was a step behind him. Falcone assessed the room and made a choice, the right choice for once in his career, and did not escalate. Barone's men were already detained. The estate was secure. It was over. Dante looked at me from across the archive room, at the envelope visible at my collar, at the fact that I had not, despite direct instruction, stayed in the library with the door locked. His expression was complicated. "I told you to stay in the library." "I know." "Sarah." "The service entrance," I said. I knew about it, and Falcone knew what he was looking for. If I hadn't... "I know," he said, quieter. "I know." He crossed the room and pulled me against him, and I pressed my face into his jacket and breathed, and his hand came up to the back of my head. We stood there in the archive, the room where I'd come to find proof of everything that had been taken from me, and held on. The formal clearing of Vittorio Bellante's name took 11 weeks. Dante's legal team handled the documentation with the kind of efficient, thorough precision that comes from both genuine commitment and significant institutional power. The manufactured evidence was formally identified. The original authorization, Enzo Ravello's 9-page directive, was submitted to the appropriate channels through intermediaries with legal standing in a process that produced no public spectacle and no family war. It was managed. It was resolved. It was, by every measure I'd imagined for 10 years, complete. There was a small notation in a county probate record, a posthumous correction, my father's name cleared. I sat with it for a long time, and then I let it go. Not because it didn't matter, because it was done, because I had carried the weight of it for 10 years, and the weight had been necessary. It had been the ballast that kept me moving forward when everything else was gone. And now the thing had been resolved, and I was allowed to set it down. Falcone was removed from his position, quietly, completely, without drama, which was the outcome that served everyone most efficiently. Barone faced consequences that I was not privy to and did not ask about. The archive was completed, all 912 documents catalogued, preserved, and formally inventoried. And I did not go back to Brooklyn. It was not a simple thing. It was not a clean or perfectly logical thing. There were months of difficult conversation and necessary honesty and the particular work of learning how to trust someone whose world operated by rules that would never fully be mine. There were things about Dante Ravello that I accepted with clear eyes, the nature of what he was, the cost of the power he held, the reality that our life together would exist inside a world that did not forgive softness. I was not soft. I had not been soft since I was 17, but I was done being only hard. The night I finally called myself Sarah Bellante again, out loud in a room without flinching, Dante was sitting beside me. He heard it and said nothing. just looked at me with those black eyes and put his hand over mine on the table. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't mark it as a milestone. He simply stayed, which was, I had learned by then, how Dante Ravello said everything that mattered most. We were not a fairy tale. We were two people shaped by loss and power, and the specific gravity of secrets that had been kept too long. We were the wreckage of old sins, choosing to build something that the sins could not reach. And some nights, when the lights were low and the city was far away and his arm was around my shoulders and we were just two people in a quiet room, I thought, I came here to find proof. I found that too. But I also found this. And this, I had never planned for. This was the part that saved me. She came for justice and stayed for something she never allowed herself to name until it was already too late to walk away from. That's the thing about secrets kept long enough. They stop being weapons. They become the last wall between you and the life that's been waiting. Serafina Belante spent 10 years believing that truth was the only thing worth fighting for. She was right. She just didn't know until she walked through the wrong door in a private club on a rainy Thursday night. That truth had more than one shape. If this story found you tonight, if Sarah's voice felt like yours, even a little, then you already know how these stories live inside you long after the last word. Subscribe if you're staying. Drop a comment if this one hit different, and share it with someone who needs a story that doesn't look away from the dark. The darkness is always better with company. See you next time.